Welcome to Breaking Green, a podcast by Global Justice Ecology Project. In Southeast Cameroon, indigenous peoples are relegated to living on the side of roads as logging concessions, national parks, and trophy hunting now occupy their ancestral land. Traditionally, the Baka have seen the forest as a place of joy and abundance, but a history of violence in the name of conservation continues to haunt and unfold within a community our next guest has documented, photographed, and written about extensively. In her article, Violence and Enclosures in the Forest of Southeast Cameroon, a visual essay, Zahra Moloo examined the effects of violence and its relationships with the enclosure of forests by conservation entities, trophy hunting outfits, and logging. Zahra Moloo is an investigative journalist, documentary filmmaker, and researcher from Kenya, currently based in Montreal. Her work focuses on extractive industries, land rights, conservation, and security. Zahra has worked as a reporter and documentary producer for The New Humanitarian, covered stories in Kenya, Tanzania, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Libya, and Palestine. Zahra's work has been featured in Al Jazeera, BBC, CBC, CCTV's Faces of Africa, and Jacobin. Zahra is a board member of Global Justice Ecology Project. Zahra Moloo, welcome to Breaking Green.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
What brings you here today, and thank you for being here, is your work on Cameroon and the Baka people. Could you just give us a brief overview of what you're doing there?
Yes. So thank you so much for having me. So the basically I started doing research on conservation many years ago as a journalist, and most of that work was looking at Virunga National Park and the communities, the Bambuti forest communities that have been evicted from that park. And that park is very, very well known. You know, it has had a whole film made about it. It's sort of one of the poster child of conservation in some ways. But what I found is that, this park, there were a lot of people had been evicted, as often occurs in fortress conservation. And I'll just quickly explain what that is. I'm sure that your listeners have listened to other programs, but fortress conservation is basically this model of creating national parks, creating these areas that are supposed to be pristine wilderness without any people in them. And that means that the people who live there and who've lived there for thousands of years have to be removed, often forcibly, in order to create these pristine areas for other people to consume and enjoy. So I began looking at DRC, but then in 2024 there was a war in the east because of the M23 rebellion that is still happening now, and so I ended up going to Cameroon to look at what's been happening around the parks in the east of the country, the southeast of the country. And there you have three parks in that area that I was looking at. One is called Lobeke National Park. And Lobeke is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It was created in 2001 as part of a much larger conservation area, which comprises of Cameroon, the Republic of Congo, and the Central African Republic. And then next to Lobeke National Park are two parks called Boumba Bek and Nki. And these two make up the largest protected area in Cameroon. So I was interested in going there mostly because I had read some of the reports that Survival had published over many decades about the violence that had happened around those parks towards Baka people. And there were really harrowing, horrible accounts of torture, of people's homes being burnt to the ground, of humiliating acts that Baka people were made to perform by guards protecting those parks. In some cases, people had been killed. And so I was interested in what was happening there. And so I went there to investigate what is the relationship between conservation and this long history of violence. Why is this violence? Why did it continue for so long? Why is it of such a horrific physical nature? So I really went to understand sort of the dynamics of conservation in that area of Southeast Cameroon.
Well, and you did a lot of photography too. And I was reading a paper of yours, Violence and Enclosures in the Forests of Southeast Cameroon, a visual essay in the journal Rethinking Marxism, which is published by Routledge. And you have some fantastic photographs. They really help you see and maybe have more of a feeling what's going on there. What were your impressions of the Baka people when you got there and were able to live with and photograph them?
Well, I have to give a lot of credit to other, people who had written about the Baka, indigenous people who've written about that area, but also other anthropologists, geographers, and so on. And so even before I went, I spoke to quite a few people and got a sense of what it was like. But yeah, I mean, I think what really struck me is that, these are communities that had actually been moved out of their lands quite some decades ago. In fact, there was even, when I got there, I thought that most of them live on the side of the road, on the side of major roads. They don't actually live in the parks. And I had thought that the reason they lived on the side of the road was because they had been moved from the parks. But actually, this was a policy by the French colonial government of moving people out of the parks for various reasons. And that continued with the post-colonial government. So it was actually a government policy to remove people from the parks, from the forests, and it allowed the state to control them a lot more, but it also allowed them to have access to education. So a lot of them, when I spoke to them, said they didn't want to go back to the parks in the way that we might think they would, because they still wanted access to social services, access to education, which is also very difficult for them to access because of the lack of infrastructure. There are not good roads. It's a very, very, it's an area of the country that's very neglected. So there's very few social services. There's no running water. There's no electricity. But they still have access to some services by living on the side of the road. But they want to also have access to the forest, which they don't. And that is causing this huge sort of transformation in terms of disconnection from their traditional cultures and their lands, and an inability to transmit this sort of very amazing, rich knowledge that they have to younger people. And I was quite amazed at how some Baka are able to, the few who have managed to, go to school, to get to go to university in some cases, some have become lawyers. They try to have this sort of relationship with the forest, and at the same time do their legal work and try to advocate for the rights of other Baka people. And I was very amazed by that, sort of those two worlds that they try to occupy. But I think what really struck me is the violence of not just conservation, but, you have the national parks, but right around the national parks, you have trophy hunting areas. And you see these, Americans and Russians and Mexicans and, these rich hunters who come and they pay, $46,000 or more actually for a hunting package. They come and they just kill all these animals. They take them as trophies. But the Baka are not allowed to kill those animals. They're prevented from accessing the forest. They cannot hunt animals. But yet these very rich people can come and hunt animals on their land. And then you also have these logging concessions. So the whole forest has been carved out into these areas that are all for the means of accumulation and profit. And the Baka are completely removed from this land. And if they are allowed to go back, I mean, they're in 2019, actually, and this is a much longer story, which I can tell. But in 2019, the government signed an agreement with the Baka to give them access rights to the national parks. So the idea was that they should have some form of access to the forests. And this was an agreement that was many, many years in the making and only got signed in 2019. But But that access comes with so many restrictions and caveats. So, for example, in Baka culture, you can go. There are many traditions that occur in the forest that require a long period of time. They require people to go for weeks into the forest. They require Baka to be able to hunt elephants sometimes, to basically have a relationship with the forest that's not mediated and restricted by the state and by conservation. But that's the agreement that they've signed with the Bakas. You can have this little bit of access to the forest, but only for like a few days, or only if you make sure that you sign this paper asking for permission, and only if you go as a family, and only if you kill an animal with a spear. You're not allowed to use guns. So so this agreement isn't really a form of genuine access. But what a lot of Baka did say is that the agreement they signed did result in a reduction in violence by conservation guards towards them. So that is one good thing that has occurred.
You used the term, or you referred to the sedentization of the Baka during the period of French colonialism. I'm interested, or could you help us understand, when did the dispossession of the Baka begin?
I think there's there are many layers to that story, because in Cameroon today, the Baka are basically, one could say, at the very bottom of this so-called social hierarchy in Cameroon. And that has, a long history of how the nation state of Cameroon was formed, who is considered to be part of the nation state. And this issue of sedentarization is very much linked to agricultural communities. So there's an excellent book by a Cameroonian historian or anthropologist about this, in which she explains how the government, basically, belonging to the nation state, was tied up with agriculture and with sedentarization. So communities that, like the Baka, who are not sedentary, who have a relationship with the forest rather than with the soil as agriculturalists, were not considered as part of the nation in the same way. So their marginalization began, at that time when the nation state was forming, and when they were not really considered as part of the nation state. And, this is also tied up with a lot of bureaucratic things. Like, for instance, a lot of them don't have ID, they don't have a citizenship, proof of citizenship. And so there's a whole, there's a lot of, there's Baka people who are working with organizations to try and get birth certificates for them, so that they can prove that they're citizens, so they can also go to school. So there are all these sort of snowball effects of not having the proper papers of citizenship. But in terms of conservation, the other thing that carries over from the colonial period is the legal infrastructure that both the Germans and the French put in place, these legal instruments that declared all land to be property of the colonial state. And this isn't just in Cameroon, this is in many countries, this idea that, the land is the property of the colonial state. But then this legal infrastructure continued into the post-colonial period under Amadou Ahidjo, the first president of Cameroon, who was basically put in his position by the French, and he maintained a very close relationship with France. And so the land continued to be as much under state control as it was under colonialism. But also at that time, you had, this whole push to create national parks in Africa. And so this was at the turn of the 20th century, when the UK, for example, organized a conference on the preservation of wild animals, birds and fish in Africa. Then in 1933, you had another conference for the protection of flora and fauna. And both of these were organized by big game hunters in Africa who came from members of Britain's and Europe's aristocracy. And so from there, you had these documents that started to outlaw African hunting practices, started to create a system of national parks in which hunting was prohibited. Hunting by Africans was prohibited. And then you had protected areas that came about, in the 1930s, and so on. And then later on in the 2000s, the number of protected areas really increased and almost doubled. Basically, in 2015, you had national parks constituting around 88% of the territory, and trophy hunting zones constituted about 11% or 12% of the national territory. So quite a lot of Cameroon's land is now national parks. I think there are about 22 estimated national parks. And so that's where sort of the legal infrastructure and the national park establishment, that's sort of the history which underpins the reasons why the Baka are now not able to go into the parks or live in the parks, and their marginalization from the forests.
So that's interesting, and troubling. So you have the Baka people. You met many living on the roadside. You have them now trying to even prove citizenship. They've been taking off their land. I mean, obviously their culture's been heavily impacted. But you also mentioned violence. Could you tell us a little bit about violence? Because violence is a big part of your article. You mentioned that material violence is really a nodal event with a past, present, and future, and that it has ripples throughout people and their memory. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that quote came from Simon Springer, the violence having a past, present, and future. So a lot of scholars have actually written about how violence has always been an inherent part of conservation, actually. And it's always been, since the establishment of national parks, violence is sort of underpins the whole thing. And part of that is, again, going back to this term of fortress conservation, beginning with the very first creation of national parks in the US, including Yellowstone National Park in 1872, which required, Native Americans being removed from their land. That model has become the dominant model of conservation everywhere in the world. And, but beyond, of course, dispossession and eviction and removing people from their land is extremely violent and has led to, millions of conservation refugees around the world. But I think, my interest in this topic was the kind of violence that was happening in the Congo Basin in particular, that has been documented by the Rainforest Foundation, by Survival International, in 2019 by BuzzFeed News, that did a huge investigation into WWF and that organization's financing of eco-guards who have been extremely violent towards indigenous people in the Congo Basin. And so I think that was what was, really struck me, as why, not so much what was the reason for this violence, but is there a reason why violence continued for so long and was so brutal? Is there a relationship between the success of conservation and violence and the way capitalism works in the forests of Southeast Cameroon? And so I write about this, and I draw from, particularly people write about enclosures and, the idea that to enclose this area and to maintain this area as an enclosure that people are not allowed to go into, violence is sort of a way to discipline people to remain out of the forest, and a way to, Marx wrote about primitive accumulation as part of the continuous process of capitalist accumulation. But where Marx says that primitive accumulation is one historical moment in that journey, a lot of scholars have said that primitive accumulation, which is the divorcing of the producers from the means of production, is a continuous process. So you have to continue to deter people from going into the forest. And so for me, I saw violence as acting as a form of discipline to prevent people from going into the parks, but also from going into the trophy hunting areas, because violence is not just limited to conservation guards protecting national parks, but it also occurs whenever the Baka venture into trophy hunting areas, venture into logging areas. And what I found very interesting is that logging companies, trophy hunting companies, and national parks collaborate in terms of financing these anti-poaching operations that end up being very brutal towards the Baka. So these three seemingly contradictory activities of trophy hunting, national parks, and logging are actually sort of part of the same package of what the government calls sustainable development. So where I thought it was crazy to have a trophy hunting area right next to a national park because an animal will just wander out of the national park and in front of a gun, that's sort of a model of development that the Cameroonian government is actually pursuing and considers sustainable. So violence is kind of part of this, one could say, sustainable development package or idea that is considered perfectly normal, both, in Cameroon, but also according to the UN, where you can have social, environmental, and economic activities all together. And that somehow isn't a contradiction.
This is your host, Steve Taylor, and we will be back right after this.
If you're enjoying this episode of Breaking Green, please subscribe or follow wherever you get your podcasts. The interviews heard here are often ignored by mainstream media, and without your support, these stories would not be covered. Consider leaving a review and sharing it with friends and colleagues. You can find the full catalog of previous episodes and sign up to have future episodes delivered straight to your inbox at breakinggreen.org.
You can't find freedom anywhere else.
Welcome back to Breaking Green. And what is a contradiction is some of this parkland was established in some way under UNESCO, and that
yes, Lobeke is.
And you think of that as a UN cultural, scientific, educational organization, but here we have a whole culture that's been dispossessed, and now it's people living on the side of a road. That seems to be inconsistent. It's hard to square that circle. It's some dissonance there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the UN's definition of sustainable development is a very neoliberal sort of idea that you can reconcile economic activities with environmental protection, that it isn't a contradiction to have, extraction or logging, and then also conservation, and then also social programs for the indigenous people. And yeah, I mean, for us, it's a contradiction, but according to the neoliberal sort of idea of social change or of sustainable development, this is fine. And I believe Survival wrote something about UNESCO's complicity in conservation injustices.
I mean, what does the violence against the Baka people look like? What effect has it had on them? What's the reality that you saw there?
Yeah, so I went around to quite a lot of different places. Some were right next to the park, some were next to the logging areas, some were quite far away. And so there were very different sort of experiences. But I think, there were certain areas where people had lived really terrible violence. And over time, some of this was 2015, 2016, others were more recent. And so one of the interesting, I mean, of course, a lot of people were, some people have physical wounds from that time. They have trauma from those experiences of violence. But a lot, like I said, with the signing of this agreement between the government and the Baka in 2019, the violence seems to have decreased. But the Forest Peoples Program actually wrote a report saying that they're not sure whether whether the violence has decreased because the guards are no longer carrying out violent acts, or whether it's because the Baka people are no longer even going into the forest because of those many years of violence and restriction have sort of left this kind of trauma in which they say we just don't even go there anymore because we expect this to happen again and we don't trust what the government says. So, and this is also because that agreement in 2019 was only signed between the government and a very small Baka organization on behalf of all the Baka. And so a lot of Baka, I mean, some of them had not even heard of this agreement. They didn't really understand what it was. And they've been trying to do a lot of like educational awareness and, try to explain to people what it means. But there's still this fear about going into the park, and because of all these years of violence. And so it has had a very material impact on people. And in the long term, that sort of disconnection from the forest has a huge impact in terms of people's ability to continue their traditions, in terms of their relationship to the forest, in terms of their ancestral, knowledge and so on. And even just being able to visit areas where, they might have a sacred area, or someone might be buried, or something of this sort. So you see that violence doesn't just end when the violent act itself comes to an end. It has these very long-ranging consequences. And like I said, yes, the violence around the national parks appears to have decreased, but the violence by the guards who protect the trophy hunting concessions has not. And that still is preventing people from being able to access the forests.
I keep going back to what you said before. People, the Baka living on the side of the road and looking for a way forward that for many may not even be what was. But it reminds me of the enclosure movement in England. And there's that famous book, The Making of the English Working Class. And there was a lot. That was a very violent period as well, with the weavers and the Luddites. There's a lot of violence, and there was actually a changing of the population, and driving people from their culture, more rural, more agrarian, into cities to become factory workers. Is there some analog here, or am I overreaching?
No, I think in terms of the dynamics of people being removed from their land and the land being enclosed, and then people having to find other ways to survive, certainly there's parallels across in so many different ways in the global South as well. But I think so. In my piece, I write about what Kalyan Sanyal writes about in terms of when this happens in the global South, and you have in Marx would described how all these people ended up then becoming the proletariat. They migrate to cities, they become laborers, they have to work for other people, they have to earn money in a cash economy. They don't have any ways they have no control over the means of production anymore, and they have no more land. In the case of Cameroon, and other places, the indigenous people who've been removed from the forests do not become part of this working class proletariat. They don't move to the cities in large numbers. And so they kind of end up being rooted in place along the side of the road. And they're sort of not able to access this, whatever you'd want to call it, capitalist modernity, becoming, a worker in the city, but they're also not able to access the forests. So they're sort of in this liminal zone, it seems, because they don't really have access to social services, access to healthcare, access to an education is very difficult. A lot of Baka students drop out of school for a whole range of different reasons. Often they can't afford the fees. Sometimes they're bullied at school just because they are Baka. And so they end up not becoming part of this sort of army of the proletariat. And so it looks very different than, I think, England in the industrial, in the 18th and 1700s. And so a lot of Baka end up working on the farms of Bantu people. They earn like the equivalent of $1 or $2 a day. Sometimes they're paid in alcohol. And so that's really the only options that are left to them. Some of them do, cultivate, are now becoming, also cultivate crops, cocoa, plantains, and so on. But a lot of them also work for these for very little money on the farms of Bantu people. So I suppose that's, it's a very different dynamic that has occurred as a result of, changing dynamics and enclosures. But this idea that all these people then dispossessed from their land become the so-called proletariat or end up going to cities and working is not the case in this situation.
Thank you for that. It just seemed like there's parallels, and in your paper, the mention of the enclosures, and so.
No, they're definitely enclosures. Absolutely.
What would, and I know you can't speak for the Baka, but what would some sort of justice be? How do people want to move forward? I'm sure there's probably not a monolithic vision of the future within this group of people, but what would justice or restoration look like?
That's a really good question. Yes, of course, I can't speak for the many, many, many Baka people that I interviewed, but I think, what I heard from quite a lot of a lot of people, and including what I heard from a lot of people was that they want to have the same access to resources, to services that everybody else has. Whenever we'd go to different communities, we'd have a chat with them, and afterwards they'd say, "Can you please help us build a school here? Can you please help us build a road so we can get to school tomorrow, so that it's not so far away? Can you help us to have a water source over here?" They're very basic things that people just want to be able to live, just live a good life, and I'm just scratching the surface of all this. There's so much to say, but I think that a lot of people would probably want to have both the ability to access their lands and to have free access to the forests, and to have access to, to be able to have some income, to also be able to go to school, to be able to buy a mobile phone, to be able to live in those two worlds. And I think there hasn't really been any sort of, how would you say, all the violence that took place over all those years. I haven't seen any sort of accountability for any of that, So basically, after this BuzzFeed investigation, there was a whole investigation done by the WWF into the conduct of these guards, and this whole panel of experts was set up to see whether WWF held any responsibility in the violence that took place. And they didn't really, the findings were not that, WWF was directly responsible, but that they had not done enough to protect the human rights of certain communities. That was what the panel found, which seems a little bit of a watered down sort of, finding, given all the violence that took place. And so what WWF has done is to set up a grievance mechanism. That's, kind of an interesting idea, because that's what a lot of, multinational companies and mining companies, they set up these things where you can complain and bring your human rights complaints to them. And that's great. That's good. That's good that exists. But I didn't get the sense that, first of all, there's so many logistical issues to that. Just getting to a place where you can make a complaint is very complicated. Finding transport to get there, and so on and so forth. But actual accountability for this violence, I did not see this happening anywhere. And not just in Cameroon, but in all these countries where there's been so much violence from conservation, the solution seems to be, we'll put in a grievance mechanism, we'll allow some access to the forest. But the model of conservation that is practiced is still not putting indigenous people at the center. And, I think that the knowledge that Baka and other indigenous people have of the forests needs to be centered in conservation for this kind of extremely exclusionary model of conservation to stop. And so I think that's one of the things I think needs to happen going forward is to actually learn from people who've protected these areas for so long. What are their conservation processes and methods, and how can they be at the center of these, of conservation in general? And in 2022, the UN made an agreement with a global agreement to protect 30% of the earth and seas by 2030, which we're already in 2026. But that new idea of protecting 30% of the earth, a lot of people are saying, well, what is this going to look like? Is this going to be, again, the same kind of exclusionary conservation, or is there a way to actually put people at the center? And so, reconsidering this whole model and coming to terms with the very racist colonial history behind it is one of the things that I think needs to happen. And the Baka, I think, need to have access to the forests, not in this restricted way that doesn't allow them to fully practice their traditions, but in a full way.
The Baka have been taken from their land. There's a history of violence. There's a lot of trauma. Obviously, their culture has been really challenged. But whatever the way forward there is, the Baka should be central to that. Not logging, not trophy hunting, not Cameroon's, model,
yes.
Right?
Yes. I think also it's really interesting to read the work of some people who've actually, spent a lot of time with Baka. There's one anthropologist in particular, Simon Hoyt, and Jerome Lewis, and they've sort of written about the way Baka relate to and think of the forest. And for them, the forest is a place of joy and abundance. And they see, they write about how the Baka see logging companies and trophy hunting outfits as these sort of people who don't know how to share. They just hoard everything. They hoard the resources and they take them for themselves, and they don't leave anything for people. And that's a very interesting, I think just trying to understand and learn from Baka sort of ontologies and ways of understanding the forests, and seeing the forest as a place of joy and a place of spirits and a place of, rather than this, it's just a very different way of seeing the world than the Western, let's say, capitalist model, where the forest is either a resource or it's something to be consumed, whether it's by tourists, whether it's by trophy hunters, whether it's by logging companies. And learn, actually, if conservationists were actually to learn from Baka people about the forest, about how they see the forest, about how they understand the forest. I mean, you'd have a whole way of protecting the earth that's totally based in completely different values, from people who've lived there for thousands of years. So it's, and I think what really struck me about just visually just being there is, you're sitting there on the side of the road. These logging trucks are coming every few minutes. There are these massive, massive logs being taken out of the forest, and they just pass by and they spew dust all over the people who live right there on the roadside, the people who've been removed from there, so that this massive machine of extraction can just continue. And I think that was, for me, that in itself is just so violent. The juxtaposition between these huge logging trucks and these communities that are just having all this dust spewed on them. The people who come from those forests.
Well, that says a lot. That image does say a lot.
Yes.
Zahra, thank you for joining us on Breaking Green.
Thank you so much.
You have been listening to Breaking Green, a Global Justice Ecology Project podcast. To learn more about Global Justice Ecology Project, visit globaljusticeecology.org. Breaking Green is made possible by tax-deductible donations by people like you. Please help us lift up the voices of those working to protect forests, defend human rights, and expose false solutions. Simply text GIVE, GIVE, to 716-257-4187. That's 1-716-257-4187.